Okay, here we go. Here we go, as Mario, in fact, would say. I want to respond to 10 questions. I don't know why I chucked that in. 10 questions for atheists in 2021. Braxton Hunter, Trinity Radio. You may recall he made a similar video back last year, although obviously that would be 10 questions for atheists in 2020, not in 2021. But these are another 10 questions. I enjoyed responding to the last one. I enjoyed some of the interaction. I'll discuss that in a minute. So I wanted to respond to this one. Now, it's been a while, right? I know it's been a while since I made a video. Probably most of you looked at me, thought, Jim's getting a bit old. He's probably dead. So weren't expecting any more videos. But here I am, still as large as life. In fact, I'm assuming you're still alive too, and that your family hasn't just propped your corpse up in front of one of my YouTube videos, which would be a little bit weird. If they have, my condolences to your family. But I'm going to proceed on the basis that you are also very much alive. It's getting a bit random, this video already, isn't it? So I want to respond to Braxton Hunter. Now, before I do that, and in this video I'll be responding to the first 5 questions, and then the next 5 will follow in a subsequent production. Make it sound very grand. I want to respond to a tweet that Paul Ogier made. Now, let me just say in advance, I like Paul Ogier, a lot of respect for him, but I disagree with him on this. This is what he wrote. Can all the atheists agree to not answer lists of questions for atheists designed to generate attention for the asker? Can I get an amen? One of the things that I don't like about YouTube is that it seems to have become more and more ghettoized, more and more segregated, with people just watching material that affirms or what they already believe. And it's very difficult. Everybody wants to watch stuff that they agree with in a way. There's this strong desire for people to do that, and there's nothing wrong in that. But it seems to have gotten worse and worse, with people actively seeking to avoid things which might challenge their preconceptions. And so one of the beautiful things about YouTube when it started, sure, there was always an element of that, people actually going onto YouTube to have their views affirmed, right? And maybe atheists in places like the United States were as guilty of that as anybody. But there was more interaction. And one of the forms that interaction took was things like these sort of 10 questions, 5 questions, questions for atheists, atheists making questions for Christians or questions for people who believed in God. And what would happen is you would get responses. Atheists would respond, Christians, sometimes even Muslims, would respond, answer these questions, and sometimes a dialogue was struck up on the basis of that. I struck up a dialogue with a number of Christians and indeed a couple of Muslims on the basis of these dialogues. And I think that's much healthier. And in many ways, right, I would really rather like Christians and people who believe in God to listen to what I have to say, right? I don't just want to preach to the converted. And being frank, if I make a video, Why Christianity is Pants Part 21, right, how many people that don't already agree with me are going to watch that video, right? They're not, are they? It's not really a very appealing title. It's not really a very appealing way of going about our business. Whereas responding to something like this, especially because Braxton usually then makes videos where he responds in turn, plays clips of some of the responses he's had, right? Surely that's a more healthier way of doing things. And so I've never had a problem with these videos. I've always rather liked them. And so that's the basis upon which I am answering these questions. I think they've been asked in good faith. They're certainly going to be answered in good faith. Okay, so let's make a start, shall we? I've waffled on for long enough. Not that that's ever stopped me in the past. Okay, question 1.
Question 1. If you have a deconversion story from any world religion, would you mind sharing that story? If you grew up in a non-religious household, what was it like to experience being around other people who were raised religious?
So what stood out for me when I watched this, I don't have a big sort of deconversion story to tell. Sorry to disappoint. I was brought up in a very, very non-religious household, and I've never been religious. I've never believed in God, really. I told my father at the age of 6 that I didn't believe in God. And duly, I suppose this sets the tone. Even though he didn't believe in God, he said to me, well, don't be so hasty, right? You know, don't jump into something like this at 6 years old. Evaluate the evidence, make the decision for yourself, right, on the basis of how you evaluate the evidence, and deal with it as you would any other subject. He would no more tell me whether I should believe in God or not than tell me what position I should take on macroeconomic policy, or whether the marginal rate of income tax should increase by another penny. With our children, most of the time, what we hope to do, I think, most people, is to give them the evidence. Sure, we're going to tell them what our views are, but we allow them to make their own decisions, their own models of how the world works, their own worldview. It's disappointing that when it comes to religion, we don't do the same thing. And it's not always just religious households that do that, by the way. There are also non-religious households, atheist households, that seem as invested in making sure that their children have the same view as they have. And I don't think there's any need for that. Just let the evidence speak for themselves. Let children make their own decisions based upon the best quality evidence that we can give them. That's kind of my view. But I think as I've grown older, one thing that I've noted in Western societies, which was the eye-opener really, I knew this happened elsewhere in the world, but in westernized societies, just how religious some societies are and how religious some families are. As I've said, my family wasn't religious at all, but neither was my society. I recall in school at one time, in a class of about 30 children, it came up as to who went to church. There were only 2 children in the whole class that went to church. It was not a religious society at all. And religion just doesn't really function in. And it's probably as much as an eye-opener it's been for me to see how religious some Western societies still are and how religious some families still are. It would be an eye-opener to some religious people to see just how non-religious some Western societies are. And don't get confused between a non-religious society than some kind of hostility. It doesn't necessarily indicate some sort of gross hostility to religion. It's just a total indifference. Or maybe, as I had, particularly with my relationship with my father, a great interest in religion and whether God exists alongside science and philosophy and all these things, a great interest in these things, but no real commitment, no sort of pre-commitment to one answer or the other. It was just an exercise in trying to work out how we feel the universe works and what sort of models and hypotheses make sense, right? Which is very, very different, I think, from the upbringing that a lot of people have.
Question number 2. Is there anything that Christian apologists or philosophers bring that you actually do consider to be good evidence for God? And if not, how do you define evidence?
So this is a question where I really, really want to be able to say, yeah, here's an example of something that I think is a good piece of evidence. But I can't do that, I'm afraid. I'd look so open-minded if I could say that. But I find it all, frankly, profoundly underwhelming. And it's not because of... I don't need to define evidence, because it's not the way that I define evidence that's the issue, right? It's just that the evidence I'm given seems profoundly underwhelming. I always feel that this is a question: does God exist, and is it the Christian God? These are questions that I like to tackle in my mind the same way that I would tackle any other issue, right? Or at least not an issue of the heart, obviously. Not do I love my wife? Something like that I might tackle differently. But any other issue of fact, I adopt a certain set of ways of looking at it. What I see is a rational and logical way of appraising the situation. I try and be consistent. And the criticisms that I've usually had of Christians is a lack of consistency. In other words, that they adopt suddenly it's a different set of standards apply. They adopt a set of standards to their beliefs, to their religion that they were brought up in, that they would never accept anywhere else. And duly, when they talk about other religions, they don't allow other religions the same leeway. When they examine another holy text or the claims of another religion, then they start being consistent with how they would tackle anything else. But when it comes to their own religion, suddenly it's like we adopt a different sort of, it's very much a sort of softball approach to it all. And I don't have any time for that. The problem with the evidence for religion, the best evidence that there is it's of the worst kind. It's the kind of, it really is, I suppose you could say, a kind of God of the gaps thing. It's the areas of our fabulous universe that are still not understood. And within those areas, there still exists the possibility that a deity was involved. But there's a couple of problems with that. The first, from the perspective of Christianity, is that Christianity has made so many claims to explain the world around us over the years that nowadays we would just cringe at, right? And so I can't just let that go. I can't say, okay, well, you were wildly wrong then, you were wildly wrong then, you were wildly wrong then, you were wildly wrong then. But these other two, well, you haven't been proven wrong yet. You could conceivably still be right. So I've got to, I've got to frame that in some of the cringeworthy claims that have been made, I think. Okay, so a little addendum here. I'm inserting this in the video because I realise I need to add this bit. A common Christian retort is that, well, science has made some cringeworthy claims as well. So surely the same applies to science. The difference is that science doesn't claim to start from a position of absolute knowledge, or that we've got the text, we've got the science book with all the answers in, it was written 2,000 years ago. All we need to do is interpret it right. And yeah, okay, so for the last 2,000 years, people have obviously been interpreting it wrong. All the bits that looked a bit cringy, they were just misinterpreting it. But all the answers are in there, folks. We just need to uncover them through doing some more science or something. It doesn't work like that, does it? Science works from the principle that, yeah, it's going to get things wrong. We start from a position of pretty much zero knowledge and we build on that. Sometimes we'll go down the wrong path and we'll have to correct. That is the nature of it, right? So science can make cringeworthy claims. That's part of the process. Christianity seems to be somewhat different. It doesn't claim to start from a position of ignorance. God, this omniscient being, has given us all this stuff. He's told us all that we need to know, pretty much. All we need to do, because mystifyingly, he couldn't just be upfront and clear about it. Clearly he couldn't be clear about it, because if you get 20 people in a room who are Christians, they'll all give you a different interpretation of what it says in the Bible. So clearly it isn't clear. And that's the difference, right? You keep harping back to these things, to this book, to the Bible, and basing things on that. So you're tied to that. And when it's wrong, right, even if it's absolutely wrong, or even if you can worm your way out of it and say, well, it's just the way people interpreted it and they were wrong, and what it really must have meant is this, right? That's profoundly unimpressive. That is profoundly unimpressive, because all you're telling me is that A, virtually you can interpret it to mean whatever you want it to mean, and two, it's just not a good method of finding out things about the world we live in, because what we're doing is you kind of reverse engineering these answers in. We find out about the world around us by other means, and then you reverse engineer into the texts what the texts must have meant. Okay, can you see why as evidence that is profoundly unimpressive? That's the first thing. The second thing is that I suppose, well, we'll come on to this maybe in the next video when we talk about arguments for contingency. We'll come on this a little bit more. But the God that is being described within Christianity doesn't seem to meld with the God that could be shoehorned into the gaps in our understanding that still exist, I think. But in terms of the arguments that Christians make, a lot of them seem pretty desperate, and they seem to be framed in terms of a religion that has struggled to adapt. It's got too much baggage. It's struggled to adapt to a world that has changed and has left it behind, and has falsified so many things that it said. And so, well, let's try tweaking this or tweaking that. Or so, some moral philosopher comes up with an objection. Well, let's just say, okay, so it's not true because God says it's true. It's God's nature. It's God's nature. The morality of the world is just God's nature. You're just trying to find. Just feels like Christianity is just trying to find a sort of way of phrasing something that could still allow you to just cling on with your fingernails to the cliff face without falling all the way down. And I found that profoundly unappealing. When you view that in a neutral context, right? When you're not starting with a preconceived idea that Christianity is probably right, now let's discuss why it's right. Let's discuss how it could possibly be true. When you don't start from that context and you start from a neutral context, it's profoundly unappealing. And I think sometimes Christians don't grasp that. They grasp it when they look at other religions, because when they look at other religions, they don't view them, they don't allow them the same leeway as they do their own.
Straightforwardly, I'm a dog person. Here's my dog, Indiana. Dogs, cats, both, or neither?
Cats or dogs? Cats all day long. I'm afraid. I'm not a dog person. What use are dogs? What do dogs do? Being blunt, if I need something to shit on my lawn, Braxton, I'm more than capable of doing that myself.
Did Jesus exist as a single historical individual? And if so, how reasonable do you think it is for people to hold the position that Jesus did not exist?
So I like to think it's not very often that I just fudge a question and refuse to answer it, but this is probably going to be one of them where I don't. Did Jesus exist? I don't know. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. What I do know is that there are a lot of people, theist and atheist alike, right? People who have explored this issue from a religious perspective, from a secular perspective, who have quite powerful arguments each way, and I don't know. And if I say yes, I think he did exist, I'm going to get a load of people saying, well, what about this, what about this, what about this? And if I say he didn't exist, I'm going to get a load of people going, what about this, what about this, what about this? And I don't know, right? They can present their evidence. For me, it's a profoundly unimportant question. I understand why for you as a Christian it's a profoundly important question, because if Jesus didn't exist, it kind of messes up the whole Christianity thing, doesn't it? Right? It's a kind of necessary condition for Christianity is that Jesus existed. He can't be the Son of God. He can't even be the Jewish Messiah, can he? If he didn't actually exist. I don't know. You'd probably find some way of even if he didn't exist, I'm sure Christianity would find some way of explaining that away. I'm quite certain, but it would be a bit of a challenge, I think. But for me, it doesn't matter. And I'll try and explain why. There's such a big divide between Jesus existing as a person and the claims made about him. Let me tell you about the Satya Sai Baba movement. Now, Satya Sai Baba was an Indian guru. Okay, an Indian guru. Let me read you about the Satya Sai Baba movement. It's a new religious movement inspired by South Indian Hindu guru Satya Sai Baba, who taught the unity of all religions. Some of his followers have faith in his claim to be a Purna avatar, a full divine incarnation of Shiva and Shakti, who is believed to have been predicted in the Bhagavad Gita. This means that some of his followers see him as a god. The number of adherents is estimated between 6 and 100 million. So this is actually quite a big deal, right? Now, Satya Sai Baba died in 2011. So I think one thing that we could agree on is that he existed. There's video footage of him. There's pictures of him, right? I think we can probably both agree that he existed, but I think we'd probably both agree that he isn't a god, right? That he may have made claims that he was a god, but he isn't a god. So really, neither of us are too hung up on the fact that he existed, right? Our beliefs about any of this are not contingent upon Satya Sai Baba having not existed. And the way that I feel about Jesus is exactly to 10 decimal places the same as how I feel about Satya Sai Baba. I couldn't give a damn whether he existed or not. Doesn't really matter. I suppose I've got a sort of historical interest in whether he actually existed or not, I suppose. But I'm really not bothered from a religious perspective. It doesn't really affect whether I would believe in God or not in any way, shape or form. I suppose, like I said, if I knew for certain he didn't exist, well, then that would be another nail in the coffin for Christianity. But it's a nail that isn't needed. I'm looking down at the coffin lid of Christianity from my perspective, and it's nails all the way round. It doesn't need an additional nail at this point.
Of your Christian friends and family members, which one would stand the best chance of convincing you or persuading you than the others? Even if you think none of them stand a chance, some stand more of a chance than others, right? Who would that be and why?
No, I don't think there are any. What a profoundly dissatisfying answer. But I don't think there are any. Look, if I'd never had these conversations with people, if I was just starting out on this journey, then that would probably seem like quite a close-minded answer. But I've had these conversations with people so often. There's so much of Christianity and Christian interpretation of the Bible and Christian claims that just makes zero sense to me. Right? It's running the Matrix trilogy a close second in being unintelligible garbage as far as I'm concerned. It doesn't. There are people, just like the Matrix trilogy, you will come across people who claim to know what it's all about, but you ask them a few questions and it's clear they don't really understand it any more than you do. And that's kind of how I've found this. There are people, Christians, who claim, yeah, I understand it all, but you ask them a few questions and you're none the wiser on the basis of that. I suppose the one person who could convince me, right, if he's real, he's supposed to come back again, Jesus. Get Jesus in the room, maybe he can explain it. But I don't know how, because some of it just doesn't seem to, right from the word go, the Bible doesn't seem to make any sense. You have the Christian interpretation, as I understand it, is that the serpent in the Garden of Eden was not a serpent, it's the devil disguised as a serpent. That's not the Jewish interpretation, it's the Christian interpretation. That is the devil. Right. It's not a serpent, it's the devil. So what does God do? Does God punish the devil? No, he punishes serpents. He delimbs them forevermore so that they have to slither along the ground. Fortunately, right, these snakes, as we call them, fortunately, they're quite well designed, as it happens, for slithering along the ground. It's a good job he didn't disguise himself as a pig, isn't it? Otherwise, you'd have these limbless pigs flopping on the ground, trying to snuffle around for truffles or whatever they eat. And so, it's a good job that it was but that what sense is there in that? Okay, I know what you say. So, well, that's just a story. It's just an allegory. It's not true. We don't literally believe it. But as a story, that doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that a just God would punish the snakes for something that the devil did whilst disguised as a snake. And then you'll find a Christian, for example, who says, yeah, I don't believe any of the Adam and Eve stuff. But you'll say, but what about Jesus? Well, Jesus died to save us from our sins. Well, what sins? Well, our sinful nature. Well, where does that come from? From the original sin of Adam. So he's died to save us from a sinful act that never actually occurred. It's like what Christianity needs, quite frankly. I talked about the Matrix. Frankly, if it was a film series, it would be time for a reboot. Okay, because the timeline and all the stories have been jigged around that many times to try and shoehorn it into all the objections that people have found and all the scientific discoveries. There really is just time to start again, right? What Christianity could do with is a reboot. It's like saying, okay, let's just get rid of this Bible and let's rewrite it so it makes a little bit more sense, because it just doesn't. So maybe Jesus could convince me, but I'm baffled to know. I mean, I suppose, look, if he just said, look, I'll just do some things to prove it or whatever, then maybe he could. But it still wouldn't make sense, if you see what I mean. He could maybe get me to the point where I'd believe in God and I'd accept, well, okay, I've been wrong. I mean, I went by the evidence as best as I could see it, and it didn't look like any of this was true, but okay, I accept it. You've just passed the Earth through the centre of the sun, and we've all emerged unharmed on the other side. That's pretty compelling, that's a pretty good conjuring trick you've done there, Jesus. I believe you now. But it still wouldn't make sense. I'd be believing it and thinking, well, okay, I believe it, but I'm still looking at all these stories, and it all just seems, it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So that's probably as good as it could get. It's profoundly disappointing. I think I'm beyond help now. I'm beyond salvation, because I've heard all the arguments, and it just sounds like trying to cobble together right? Maybe it's just me, but it just sounds like trying to cobble together some way of maintaining a semblance of respectability and allowing people to keep believing something which, if you just look at it at face value, is an absolute load of... It just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't fit together. It's been... I mean, if you look at the historical perspective of the Bible and the claims of how it's written, and trying to satisfy these different groups, you know, the Yahwists and all these different groups, the priestly parts and all this sort, and putting these stories together, and that's why some of these stories, like the flood story, it seems to repeat itself because they're taking the different versions to try and satisfy all these different sort of Israelite groups. Then that makes sense, you know. And taking these stories and bringing in bits from Sumerian myths and all that makes sense. But trying to view it from a Christian perspective, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It doesn't to me, and I cannot foresee a human person being able to resolve those problems for me. Okay, that's the end of this one. I'll get on to the next 5 questions in the next video. I actually thought the second 5 questions were probably more interesting than the first 5. Last thing that I want to say is to thank my patrons, because I know I have like 91 patrons, I think, that have stood by me despite me not making a video for 5 months, which is pretty amazing. It hasn't cost them anything because I get paid on a per video basis, but nevertheless they could have sort of just decided, well, he isn't making videos anymore, I'll go and, you know, allocate my money somewhere else, and they haven't done so. Thank you so much to those people. Okay, that's it for now. I'll see you in the second part. Bye for now.